And talking about unemployment, on Friday, Nigeria's unemployment data, which has been long awaited, was finally released. And the report shows the unemployment rate in the second quarter 2020 was 27.1%, up from the 23.1% recorded in the third quarter 2018. Well, joining me to dissect these numbers further is the chief consultant at Adedipe Associates, Dr. Biodun Adedipe. We will also get the perspective of the Nigeria Employers Consultative Forum and, of course, that of the International Labour Organization. But first, let's talk to Dr. Adedipe. Good morning, Dr. Adedipe, for joining us on the program.
Thank you, Chimize. Good morning. Pleasure being with you this morning.
You're welcome. Now, are you concerned that the latest unemployment report did not include figures for the past 6 quarters? Some analysts believe this will have a distortionary impact on the trend analysis of unemployment, as the second quarter 2020 numbers will only be compared to the third quarter of 2018, and it could also lead to a significant bias in policy decision making. What do you think?
Yes, I quite agree with that sentiment, because personally, as an analyst, I am worried because in my thinking, this is a particular agency of government that should be well funded, because without data and information necessary for planning, all you are doing is just planning the air, as we describe it. So if the latest we had was for June 2020 compared to September 2018, that is not good in terms of trend analysis, and you can't really make much sense of that in terms of the dynamics of the environment where we operate, and in fact in the world we belong to. So one of the arguments some of us have been making over the period was that the federal government should fund the National Bureau of Statistics very well, so that this critical data can be generated on a quarterly basis. That way we can see the trend and we can do proper planning. I am really, really concerned about that.
Now, do you think that the issue here is all about inadequate funding for the National Bureau of Statistics?
Well, I say that advisedly, because I've come across that personally when I probed why NBS is not putting out such critical data on a quarterly basis. And one of the things we got in the course of my inquiry was that agency did not have sufficient resources to carry out that kind of survey. So that is why I can say here that as a Nigerian and also as an analyst, I am worried that we are not funding what is critical to our planning and, of course, development. So it's a major issue there. And, of course, the other side of it is that, in my own understanding, NBS itself is quite ready. And they have proven that in the light of the survey, whose result was published just last week, Friday.
Now, many had argued that elsewhere, unemployment data is an economic tool used by policymakers in determining the health of the economy and policy direction, but it's not so in Nigeria. Do you share that same view, and why? Do you see this current data also being considered in the next monetary policy meeting built for next month?
Well, I expect the Monetary Policy Committee to consider this latest data and findings in terms of shaping the policy direction, especially monetary policy. And it is very simple. In most other climes, unemployment data, or if you like, look at it from the flip side of it, which is job creation data, is generated on a monthly basis. The worst we can do to ourselves is to do this quarterly. And of course, even quarterly for me is a little bit dated. All right. So what it then means is that if we're able to at least manage quarterly generation of such data, it helps planning, as I said earlier. But the other side is that for every critical government organ, whether it is the Monetary Authority, as we just said, Monetary Policy Committee, or the fiscal authorities, these are data they should be looking at on an ongoing basis to measure the current temperature of the economy, because fundamentally, what drives every economy is employment. And if you look at it the way it is dimensioned, first is to look at the economically active population, which is age bracket 15 to 64 years. And then from that, you draw out the labor force, which of course will be those who are able to work and also willing to work. Now, from there, you now get to those who are actually searching for jobs. That means they have the ability to work and they are willing to work and actually searching for jobs. So now that is the pattern in terms of generating the unemployment data. So if you don't have that, I don't know what kind of planning you want to make. And of course, we also know quite well that fundamentally the number of people employed will determine those that create value within your space. So the more people that create value, the more productively engaged they are, the better for the economy. If I work, I will earn. And when I earn money, I not only become also a potential in contributing to government revenue by discharging my, tax responsibilities, but on the other hand also, it gives me a sense of what we call social compact that gives me a voice to actually also challenge the government as to what they are doing with the money that they got from me as a tangible person working within that economy. So it has so many dimensions to it. That's apart from any money to take care of my own immediate family's needs and contribute to the environment where I live. So it has so many ramifications for the economy. And that is why it's an important metric to measure regularly and then respond to that in terms of the appropriate policy that will drive the economy in the right direction.
All right, Dr. Adedipe, let's look at some of the numbers there. 27.1%, yes. That's what the figure says for the second quarter of 2020 from 23.1%. Is this in line with your expectations considering the effect of the coronavirus pandemic?
Indeed, although I may again say that I usually, when I interpret this data, look beyond the unemployment rate. I also take into account the underemployment rate. So if you truly want to interpret this and understand the sense of urgency in it, then you want to take also the underemployment rate of 28.6%. So which if you take along with the unemployment rate, we give you something in the 55.7% range. So that tells you immediately that you have a crisis on hand. So, but again, you see, in context of what is happening globally, we expected this to happen when we began to interpret the effect of the pandemic economically all over the world. When we started to look at this way back in March, we told ourselves there are 4 different crises countries will be facing. There's the health crisis, yes, that you need to spend money to resolve, but there's the economic crisis that comes out of your response to the health crisis, which is the lockdown. Of course, well over 50% of global population was locked down at some point. So now the crisis from that will lead into what we call humanitarian crisis. You don't handle it well through palliatives and interventions variously, it becomes a security crisis. So all of these come together in the purview of unemployment, which means so many jobs will be lost. And the question should be, even before that will happen, what did you put in place to prevent that? What are you doing, for example, with self-employed people? Yeah, which is Dr. one of the ways. Yes,
Dr. Adedipe, let me take it out from there. Now, just from what you've noted, now unemployment was highest among the youths. What does that tell us, about the government's job creation mechanisms and levels? How adequate are they, considering the growing number of graduates that enter into the labor market on an annual basis? I mean, the government have come up with so many job creation mechanisms to support the youths. Yeah. Are they adequate?
Now, first is to say that it is inadequate, but for me also, it's a policy headed in the wrong direction. And my reason is very simple. Governments cannot create enough jobs. When you look at the number of people that are unemployed, but don't also forget that where we are today, the unemployment data we're talking about today is not only the result of the normal pattern over the years. You are looking at the situation of pandemic, which on the one hand, people who had jobs lost their jobs, okay? Families also that were well off with only one member of the parents was working. Now the second parent also had to look for a job. Okay, so that we add also to those that are willing and able to work. Then, of course, you now come to what you mentioned now, which is we are producing graduates from our higher educational institutions that annually add to the labor force. So if you don't track this and also recognize that it is the private sector that actually will create most of the jobs, in which case your policy is not about government opening the space or we want to hire 500,000 teachers. Yes, it is good, okay, in terms of what that we do. But more importantly is what is the government doing in terms of policy that will help private sector operators to create more jobs. But that's why you get a lot more of what will help this economy in resolving unemployment. So it then means, of course, that government agencies will be thinking of policies in terms of execution that will help the self-employed person, those corporate entities, to actually employ more people. How will that happen? If, for example, a government agency comes to in a particular sector, says, what we are going to do is for our services that we render to companies under our purview, we are going to charge them in a foreign currency. Now tell me, how does that work in terms of managing the exchange value of the naira? So if my own government here will demand for me to pay for some government charges and levies in US dollars, for example, just to illustrate, that means in order for me to do business in Nigeria, where I naira, I must look for dollars to pay the government charges. So that constitutes to demand pressure in the foreign exchange market on the one hand. So how does that go back into the companies in question? So the pressure on them is that they cannot create more jobs. They will be more concerned with surviving in an environment where we have inflationary pressures on the one hand, and then the domestic currency is also losing value. Okay, so it means that we are not doing things that will make those companies create more jobs. Rather, we are doing things that can make it more difficult for them to even sustain what they have on their payroll currently.
Okay, now before I let you go, Dr. Adedipe, now the underemployment rate followed a similar trend, rising at a faster pace to 28.6 from 20.1% in 2018. Now this shows deterioration in the quality of employment. Now, inflation numbers, of course, will be published later today, and no doubt it's on the upward trajectory. Unemployment plus underemployment plus inflation, well, equals to misery. So where do you see Nigeria's misery index at the moment? For the FDC, they say 68.26%.
Yes, indeed, because we track that data. There are 4 elements that make called the misery index. Okay, you have your lending rate, you have the interest rate, and you have the unemployment rate. Add those 3 and then subtract the GDP growth rate from that. That gives you your misery index. So if you look at the pattern in the last, let me say the last 7 years, 2013 till date, you see that our misery index in Nigeria has been going up steadily. And in fact, the latest check on that data, which will be for the 3rd quarter of 2018, because that was when the 4 data were complete. So until we get the GDP data later this month, we can't actually compute what the misery index is as of today, unless we just do an estimate of the GDP growth rate. But when we have the official data, now compute that, I don't expect anything less than 70%, which means that when you have misery index at 70%, it means the rate at which the regular person living in Nigeria is miserable is about 70%. So until those rates start to come down, and that is talking about the lending rate, then of course you have the unemployment rate, and of course you place that side by side with the inflation rate and then GDP growth rate. So our GDP, therefore, that's where it starts from, must be growing at a rate that can actually trade off against those 3 other rates. So it means that the real central issue here is production. We must get back to the real sustenance of an economy and going to make it to grow. And that is to produce here what we consume and to also consume what we produce. Until we are able to create that nexus, we'll be running with challenges in those 4 different rates, which means your economy is not growing enough on the one hand. And then secondly, you have a situation where it is like a running target in dealing with these 3 other rates you set the growth rate of the economy against. That's where the real challenge is. Production is the key issue. So produce what we consume what we produce. All of these variables will begin to change, and the misery index will start trending downwards.
All right, thank you very much for sharing your thoughts there, Dr. Adedipe. Dr. Biodun Adedipe is the Chief Consultant at B. Adedipe Associates. Thank you for your time, Dr. Adedipe.
Thank you for having me.